The biting cold of Christmas Eve was almost unbearable, as heavy snowflakes blanketed the streets in a pristine white. Everywhere Mark Turner looked, the world seemed to glow with festive cheer, colorful lights twinkling in windows, families walking hand in hand, laughter spilling out from cozy homes. It was supposed to be a time of celebration, of togetherness and love, but for Mark, Christmas Eve had taken a cruel, unexpected turn. Mark, a widower raising 2 young children, had always worked hard to provide for his family. After his wife Laura tragically passed away from cancer 2 years ago, Mark had thrown himself into his job at the factory to make sure Emily and Jack had everything they needed. It wasn't much, just a small apartment and the basics to get by, but it was enough to keep his family together. This Christmas, though, Mark had promised something special. Emily, now 7, had been asking for a new doll for months. And 5-year-old Jack had his heart set on a toy train. Mark had scrimped and saved every penny, hoping to give his children the magic of Christmas they deserved. That morning, he woke up feeling optimistic, despite the financial pressure weighing on him. There was something about Christmas that always made Mark believe things would work out. As he dressed for work, he thought about how excited Emily and Jack would be when they woke up the next morning to find presents under the tree. But when he arrived at the factory, his hopes were dashed. The atmosphere was tense, unlike any other day. Mark noticed the whispers among his colleagues, the way they avoided looking at him directly. Then, just before the shift started, his boss, Mr. Reynolds, called him into the office. Mark sat down, his heart racing. Mr. Reynolds was a gruff man, but not unkind. Today, however, there was a heaviness in his voice as he spoke. "Mark, I'm afraid I have some bad news. The company's cutting back, and I hate to do this, but we have to let you go." Mark's stomach dropped. "You're letting me go?" His voice was barely above a whisper. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had worked there for 8 years, never missed a day, always did his job without complaint. How could this be happening, especially on Christmas Eve? "I'm really sorry, Mark," Mr. Reynolds continued, his eyes filled with regret. "I wish there was another way, but there just isn't. You'll get your final paycheck at the end of the week. I know it's not much, but it's all we can offer right now." Mark sat in stunned silence, the weight of the news crushing him. How would he explain this to his kids? What would happen to their Christmas? The bills were already piling up, and now, without a job, he didn't know how they'd make it through the month. Leaving the factory, Mark felt numb. Snow continued to fall, but the world around him seemed to blur as he walked the familiar streets back home. Each step felt heavier than the last. He passed houses with Christmas lights twinkling cheerfully, families inside gathered around their trees, preparing for a joyful night. But for Mark, there was no joy, only dread. How was he going to tell Emily and Jack that Christmas was ruined? When he finally reached his apartment, the small space felt colder than usual. Emily and Jack were in the living room, eagerly waiting for him to return, their faces lighting up the moment he walked through the door. "Daddy, Daddy!" Jack ran up to him, his eyes shining with excitement. "Did you get the presents? Is Santa coming?" Jack finally. Mark forced a smile, his heart aching. "Not yet, buddy," he said softly, kneeling down to hug his son. "Santa's coming tomorrow. We just have to be patient." "Suppose it was my brother," he whispered. Emily, always the more perceptive one, sensed something was wrong. She watched her father closely, her brow furrowed in concern. "Are you okay, Daddy?" Mark swallowed hard, trying to keep his voice steady. "Yeah, sweetie, I'm fine," he lied. "Why don't you both go get ready for bed? Tomorrow's a big day." As the children scampered off to their room, giggling about what Santa might bring, Mark felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. Once they were asleep, he sat at the kitchen table, staring at the pile of bills he couldn't pay, at the empty space where presents should have been. How could he have failed them like this? The guilt gnawed at him, and for the first time in a long while, Mark allowed himself to cry. He thought back to last Christmas, the first one without Laura. It had been difficult, but somehow they had managed to make it special, sharing memories of her and holding on to the love she had left behind. But this year felt different. The burden of loss and financial strain seemed unbearable. The weight of being both mother and father to his children, coupled with the harsh realities of life, was wearing him down. Mark clenched his fists, feeling powerless against the tide of misfortune that seemed determined to drown him. Suddenly there was a knock at the door. It was nearly midnight, and Mark wasn't expecting anyone. He wiped his eyes quickly and went to answer the door, curious and a little apprehensive. When he opened it, he was surprised to see a stranger standing there. A tall man in a long coat, his face partially obscured by the hood he wore to shield himself from the cold. "Can I help you?" Mark asked, his voice hoarse from emotion. The stranger smiled warmly, his eyes kind. "I'm sorry to bother you this late," he said, "but I heard you could use some help." Mark blinked, confused. "I don't understand. Who are you?" The man didn't answer directly. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a thick envelope, holding it out to Mark. "Take this," he said softly. "You need it more than I do." Mark hesitated. "What is this?" "Consider it a Christmas gift," the man replied, "for you and your family." Before Mark could protest, the stranger turned and walked away, disappearing into the snowy night. Stunned, Mark closed the door and looked down at the envelope in his hands. His heart raced as he opened it, revealing a stack of cash. It was more money than he had seen in years, enough to cover all his bills and even buy gifts for Emily and Jack. There was a note inside, written in neat handwriting, "Merry Christmas. You are not alone. Pay it forward when you can." Mark's hands trembled as he read the words. He couldn't believe what had just happened. A complete stranger had shown up at his door, offering him salvation at the very moment he thought all was lost. Tears filled his eyes again, but this time they were tears of gratitude. As he sat down, the envelope clutched in his hands, he couldn't help but think about Laura. She had always believed in the goodness of people, in the idea that kindness could be found even in the darkest of times. Mark had struggled to hold on to that belief after she passed, but now, in this moment, it felt as though she was right beside him, reminding him that they weren't alone. The next morning, Emily and Jack woke up to find not only the doll and the toy train they had wished for, but also a tree full of surprises, new clothes, books, and even a few treats they had never expected. Their eyes sparkled with joy as they tore open the presents, their laughter filling the room. Mark watched them, his heart full. The stranger's gift had done more than save Christmas. It had restored his faith in humanity, in the possibility that miracles could happen when you least expected them. Later that day, as they sat down for Christmas dinner, a modest meal, but one filled with love, Mark told his children about the man who had appeared at their door the night before. He explained the importance of kindness, of helping others, and of paying it forward. "We don't know who he was or why he chose to help us," Mark said softly, "but one day, when we can, we'll help someone else the way he helped us." Emily, with her wide eyes full of wonder, nodded solemnly. "We will, Daddy. We'll make sure of it." Jack, too young to fully grasp the gravity of the situation, simply smiled and went back to playing with his toy train, blissfully unaware of the hardships his father had faced. But Mark knew that, one day, when the time was right, his children would understand the lesson they had learned that Christmas. That even in the toughest of times, there was always hope, and that kindness had the power to change everything. Mark never saw the stranger again, but he never forgot the man's kindness, and as the years went by, whenever he encountered someone in need, he would remember the note, "Pay it forward when you can," and he did, time and time again. That Christmas, in the midst of all the uncertainty and sorrow, Mark learned that sometimes the greatest gifts weren't wrapped in paper or placed under a tree. They were found in the hearts of strangers, in the unexpected acts of kindness that could turn a life around when all seemed lost. And that was the true magic of Christmas. The next morning, Christmas arrived with a new sense of hope and promise, filling the small apartment with the first rays of winter sunlight. Mark had hardly slept, his mind racing with a mixture of emotions, relief, gratitude, and excitement. The cold, biting air outside hadn't dampened his spirits. Today was different. Today, he would give his children the Christmas they deserved. He rose quietly from his bed, careful not to wake Emily and Jack, and dressed quickly in his worn but warm clothes. The streets were still silent, coated in a fresh layer of snow from the night before, but the sight of holiday decorations sparkling in the early morning light made everything feel a little more magical. There was one store nearby, a small family-owned shop, that remained open for last-minute holiday shoppers, and Mark headed there without hesitation. With the stranger's envelope of money tucked safely in his coat pocket, he felt an unfamiliar sense of security. As he walked through the store aisles, Mark felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the cozy store interior. He carefully selected the perfect doll for Emily, the one she had been dreaming of for months. Its bright blue dress and soft curls just like the one she had described to him. For Jack, Mark found the exact model of the toy train his son had been yearning for. He could already picture the joy on Jack's face when he saw it. But there was more. With enough money left over, Mark didn't stop at the toys. He picked out groceries, more than he had been able to afford in a long time, fresh vegetables, a roast chicken, potatoes, and even a chocolate cake for dessert. The cart filled up, and so did Mark's heart. The walk back home was filled with anticipation. Snow crunched under his boots as he carried the bags of groceries and carefully wrapped gifts, his steps light despite the cold that still hung in the air. When he reached the apartment, everything was quiet. Emily and Jack were still fast asleep in their room, dreaming about the Christmas morning to come. Mark moved quickly, wrapping the gifts with the utmost care, ensuring each package was tucked neatly beneath their small Christmas tree. The sight of the gifts under the twinkling lights filled him with a sense of accomplishment he hadn't felt in years. The weight of his financial struggles and the pain of the previous night's despair seemed to melt away. As if on cue, the sound of small footsteps padded softly down the hall. The door to the children's room creaked open, and Mark could hear their sleepy murmurs turning into gasps of wonder as they entered the living room. "Daddy! Daddy! Santa came!" Emily squealed in delight, her eyes wide with amazement as she ran towards him, arms outstretched for a hug. Mark knelt down and scooped her up, holding her close as her joy spread through him like warmth on a cold day. Jack, who had been rubbing his eyes moments before, now stood frozen in awe before the gifts, his little hands trembling with excitement as he spotted the toy train. Without a word, Jack tore into the wrapping paper, revealing the train he had dreamed of for months. His laughter filled the room as he began setting it up right there on the living room floor, his imagination already taking over as he guided the train through imaginary stations and tunnels. Emily, clutching her new doll tightly to her chest, beamed with happiness as she danced around the room. "Daddy, look! It's just like I wanted!" she cried, her eyes sparkling. Mark could barely hold back his own tears as he watched them. It had been so long since he had seen them this happy, so long since he had felt like he could give them the kind of joy they deserved. For the first time in what felt like forever, the dark cloud that had hung over their family seemed to lift. The heavy burden of the past few years, the sleepless nights, the financial worries, the heartache, began to fade, replaced by the pure, simple magic of Christmas. Later that day, the three of them sat around the small but cozy kitchen table, sharing a meal that felt more special than any other holiday they had experienced in recent memory. The rich aroma of the roast chicken filled the air, mixing with the laughter and stories they shared as they ate together. Emily and Jack chatted excitedly about their new toys, their eyes still bright with wonder. And for Mark, this moment, this simple, ordinary moment of sitting together as a family, was worth more than anything money could buy. He couldn't stop thinking about the kindness of the stranger who had come to his door the night before. The man's generosity had been more than just a lifeline. It had restored Mark's faith in people, in the goodness that still existed in the world. It wasn't just about the financial help. It was about the sense of being seen, of being cared for, when he had felt so utterly alone. As the years went by, Mark never forgot that Christmas Eve. The memory of the stranger and his unexpected gift stayed with him, becoming a guiding light in his life. Whenever he encountered someone in need, whether it was a struggling family at the grocery store or a person without a home huddled on a cold street corner, he would quietly offer help, just as the stranger had done for him. He became known in the community for his quiet acts of kindness, though he never sought recognition or praise. It wasn't about being a hero, it was about paying forward the generosity that had once saved his own family. And as he did, he felt that same warmth, that same sense of purpose, knowing that he was part of something bigger, a chain of kindness that stretched far beyond him. Years later, on another cold Christmas Eve, the cycle of generosity came full circle. Mark had built a new life for himself and his children. He had a steady job, one that paid enough to ensure that they never went without. That evening, as they gathered around the tree, decorating it with ornaments they had collected over the years, there was a knock at the door. Mark opened it to find a young man standing there, shivering in the cold, his clothes worn and his face etched with worry. Beside him stood a little girl, her wide eyes filled with uncertainty as she clutched a ragged doll. Mark didn't hesitate. Without a second thought, he reached into his pocket and pulled out several bills, pressing them into the man's hand. "You don't know me," Mark said softly, "but someone once helped me when I was in your shoes. Consider this a Christmas gift. You're not alone." The man's eyes filled with tears as he thanked Mark, his voice trembling with emotion. As Mark watched him walk away into the snowy night, he felt a deep sense of peace wash over him. He had become the stranger who had once saved him, passing on the gift of hope and kindness. As Emily and Jack came running up to him moments later, their laughter filling the house once more, Mark smiled to himself. Christmas, he realized, wasn't just about the presents or the feast. It was about the moments of connection, the acts of kindness that could light up even the darkest nights, and the way a single gesture of generosity could ripple out, changing lives in ways that no one could ever fully understand.